to Studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican chapter and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Jeff Drozda,
Jessica Sanders.
And today we're going to talk about a virtue known as obedience. Just to start out with how powerful the opposite is, there's the famous quote called non serviam, I will not serve, which was spoken by Satan. This we want to stay far away from. This is a term that, I know personally, I wake up in the morning and the first thing I try to say before I step out of bed is serviam, Lord, I'm going to serve you. So in that spirit of wanting to serve God, and the number one way to do that, I think, is obedience. So that's what we're going to dive into today.
Yeah, I think that everyone is very familiar with when the evil one opted not to serve, and even the great church fathers wrote at length about pride and about how Satan decided not to serve. And it's St. Augustine who died in 430 A.D. He wrote extensively about this, but specifically in the City of God, he wrote, "Rather he, Satan, refused to be under the Creator, and by force of his own free choice he exalted himself through pride. Pride is disordered love for one's own excellence, while envy is hate for the excellence of happiness of others. Envy then cannot come about before pride, but only after it as a consequence." So I think the really important thing about today's discussion is not only overcoming pride, but through the virtue of obedience, how do we incorporate that into our everyday lives? When we say obedient, I mean, in our modern day society, when someone says, are you obedient? Nobody likes to hear that. It's very uncomfortable. People just don't, especially here in the United States. It's just that we do have this inherent pride that obviously lacks humility, and so through obedience, as we'll learn here in the next half hour, obedience can actually and will set you free.
And just a little bit to build off of what Jeff just said. That pride equals to disobedience, and then we begin to serve ourselves, and so there's a hidden treasure that I find that is in obedience, which is there's a couple of hidden treasures, which is one is peace and the other one is charity, and so when we're not obedient to God's will in our lives, then it causes chaos, and our God that we know is not a God of chaos, but he is a God of order. And so when there is order in our lives and we are obedient to God's will and not our own, then we are very fruitful in the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. And that just helps us, to be submissive to God's will.
And you were talking about order. I just shared earlier that I'd had a sort of a bad dream this morning about when I woke up. It was about just our whole house. Everybody was like eating after hours. People were not obeying any of the rules. It was just all chaos. Watching stuff, staying up too late. And I woke up and I'm like, okay, there was a message there. I mean, it's not only, so we're going to try to focus on the spiritual aspect, but even in our temporal lives, I mean, just our natural pattern of behavior, if we obey those natural things, like going to bed at a good time because God ordered it that way, we'll be healthier, we'll be happier, there's more stability in that. And then, I think that was just sort of a message that not only we see that in our natural temporal life, but in our spiritual life as well, of course. It's even important to obey God, and obey others who are God placed in our path as authorities. It makes, to be honest with you, some people get rattled, wives, be obedient to your husband. I mean, that's a refresher to me because I'm like, oh, he's got the burden, to actually discern, do we do this or not when we have these big decisions to make? Because in the end, I'm here because Jeff wanted to come to a meeting for the lay Dominicans. And in my mind, I was thinking, now, why does he want to do that? Because as a convert, it wasn't on my plate. It wasn't something I was thinking of. And then, so I went because I'm like, well, why even, he wants to do this, let's go. And lo and behold, it was like everything God had wanted to unfold for me was right in front of me. I mean, that's the kind of fruit that comes from just not brushing against. And it's a simple example. I can give probably more that I wasn't obedient and it caused more trouble, but this one was a good one. And that just reflects the fruit that comes, that peace and order that comes when you're obedient.
And I think, too, what Jeff said, I think in the society that we live in today, when we hear the word obedience or be obedient, it's like we feel maybe that we're being told what to do, when really obedience is a true surrender of truly being free and who God created us to be, and following in His commands, to love Him above all.
And when we talk about obedience, especially in terms of of authority, and of course in our instance we're talking about the church and its authority. I mean, God gave the church and its superiors and representatives, the apostles and priests and bishops and cardinals, authority on this earth. And there are many examples of where, unfortunately, Catholics, are not obedient to what the church is teaching. And the church teaches these things and offers these to us for our freedom and for our salvation. And so, we hear examples of cafeteria Catholics, or I'll pick and choose what I want to believe or what I want to adhere to. There again, that's another example of, we're leaving, obedience to be defined as within our own judgment. And that's very, very dangerous. And, God placed these church leaders on this earth for our salvation. And there comes a time when we need to be docile, we need to have humility, and we trust in God. Because, the church will give us the truth and will always give us the truth. And that's something that, we need to, take that step back. If we have, trouble with humility, trouble with obedience, this is time just to take that step back and have that reflection, because our soul is actually at stake.
And just to let people know, I mean, that authority has to be, by those who are given it, has to be considered very clearly for their salvation and their lives as well. It's a big responsibility. So we need to pray for those in authority, because we all know the woe to the shepherd, Bible verses in Jeremiah. I'm looking at one right now. Behold, it says, you have scattered my flock and driven them away and have not attended to them. Behold, I will attend to you for the evil of your deeds, declares the Lord. This is one of the woe to the shepherds verses in Jeremiah. And so it's a very serious place to be in, no matter who. If you're, like, as mom, an authority over kids, I mean, this is important. Obviously, we have to be very close, walking closely and asking for grace to do that, and praying for the assistance from God, because we need grace to do it.
And for, all those, fathers, husbands out there, we have really no choice but to be obedient to God. And that's necessary if, in fact, we want to be leaders in our families, but also have peace in our families, in our homes. And to have that, we have to be open to what God's will is, what the church teaches, and that's incumbent upon us. So if we want to have happy homes, then it really is important that we do adhere to God's will through obedience.
And I love what St. Catherine of Siena said. She said a few things about obedience in her dialogue, but one of the things was that she says, obedience shows whether you are grateful.
Wow. Yeah, that says a lot. And part of the reason we're talking about obedience is because we're reading The 3 Ages of the Interior Life by Father Garrigou-Lagrange, who is a Dominican priest and friar. So we are reading a chapter on the grandeur of obedience, and that almost sounds like it. That title is what do you call that? Not oxymoron, but is that what I'm looking for?
That's what I was going to say.
Of it, but within the chapter, he says the grandeur of obedience is expressed in this frequently quoted holy expression: to serve God is to reign. That is to reign over one's passion, over the spirit of the world, over the enemy of souls. In his suggestions, it is to reign in the very kingdom of God, and so to speak, to share in his independence toward all created things. So it goes on. It's beautiful words, but the idea, as you know, is to serve, is to reign over our passions, and it gives us the benefit of also who do we care about, like the response, like. Are we worried about what somebody else thinks? Are we worried about God thinks? When we worry about God, what God thinks, and I've said this before, the fear of God releases us of every other fear. We no longer have to worry about what somebody else thinks or says about us. That lack of worrying about judgment, it goes away. We only worry about God and what he thinks about us. And that becomes such a freeing thing, at least to me, I feel.
And I think, too, it's important, like, that what comes to my mind is, how is one obedient, or what does that look like? But obedience is from the Latin root, which means to intently listen to. So, the first step to obedience is to sit in prayer, with the Lord, and just intently listen to how he's speaking to us, how he's speaking to our hearts, because, that's the very first step of obedience, of submission to will, is to sit in prayer, and have that open dialogue with the Lord, and that starts with listening to how he's speaking to us and what he's calling us to.
Back to contemplation, which is something we have, if you've been listening to our show, over and over again, everything circles back to that contemplation. It's the beginning and it's the end. It is what we need to do, and it's a reminder for myself, too. It's for everyone. We all need to make sure we take time to be silent, listen to God, and pray, pray, pray. Never stop praying.
And for those who have not read this absolutely wonderful book, Father Lagrange makes a good point in terms of obedience, and he says, if a man does not begin by obeying well, he will never know how to command. And so, once again, for fathers and husbands out there, if we do not know how to obey God's will, what the church teaches, we will never know how to command. And so, it's these things that we have to be open to. And we were talking about humility, and how this allows us to obtain obedience. Father Lagrange talks about Saint Martin de Porres in Peru, and here is just a very simple brother, and the impact that he had on not only his community, just by serving the poor, doing the basic stuff, being the doorkeeper, being the barber, just being the simple things that he was. Hundreds and thousands came to him throughout his life for advice. It's not something that he hung a shingle and said, "Hey, I'm open for advice here." But but just by living the humble life, him being obedient to God's will, and it gave fruit to thousands of people.
And I love in the scriptures, one of the scriptures is 1 John chapter 5, verse 3, where he says, "This is love for God, obey his commandments." And so through obedience, it shows how, we come to love God and trust God, and that we want him to have control over our lives. And so just like a student needs a teacher, we need obedience, or obedience needs the virtue of prudence to help bring forth more fruit or more virtues in our lives.
So surrender too. I think there's the surrender prayer, novena. I think that'd be a great suggestion, because that's the beginning of all this, is we got to surrender everything to God.
Prayer of humility, that's always a good one. You are listening to Christ our King Catholic Radio for Acadiana. We are your lay Dominicans, Third Order Dominicans here in Lafayette, Louisiana. We're on 90.5 FM, 99.5 FM, and 1230 AM. And we are here every Thursday at 4 p.m., and we want to thank Stein Lumber for their sponsorship with locations throughout all of Acadiana. And today we are talking about obedience. And we look back in our Dominican history, and we think about St. Dominic, who was tremendously obedient, not only to his superiors and to the Holy Father at the time, but also Father Lagrange talks about the first 16 sons of St. Dominic, and how they were obedient to him in terms of when he said, go out. You will be begging and asking for food, for clothing, whatever it is you need, but just go out. And he said, I will pray for you 3 times a day. That was the only guarantee that he gave them. I'll pray for you 3 times a day. And you look at what they did throughout Spain and Italy and France and Poland. And so this was the birth of the Dominican order. And, through that humility and obedience to St. Dominic, we have thousands of Dominicans, priests and nuns and third order lay Dominicans throughout the entire world.
And I believe it was Pope Innocent that he went to ask originally for the ability to go minister to the Cathars, right? They traveled really far and to ask that, and that was denied. That actually was denied. And on the way back, it was like, what are we going to, I can imagine the discussion there. And God, put them in this near the Albigensians, and he had to deal with that heresy there. And then the Pope sent legates, and long story short, that obedience to not do what he thought his mission was, he learned in that obedience what his mission was really meant to be. And we all know that was became such a success after establishing the Dominican order.
Nobody likes to be told no, but there is growth through that. It's like if anyone's have ever lost a job before, that's a horrible experience, but there is tremendous growth that comes through that. Whether it's you making the decision to expand on your education or look in a different area, it motivates you, obviously, to look at other options. And so, when someone says no, then the door closed, but the window's open, and it's a great opportunity for growth.
Yeah, and our own one of the things I was reflecting on is that in our own judgment, or in our own rash judgments, it can most certainly lead us to bondage. And God, as we said at the beginning, God is a God of order. So God gives us order in His name, and when we practice obedience through faith, then we conform to God's will and what He desires in our own lives.
And that's it. Our Lord actually said, "Thy, not my will, but Thine be done." And I think that's just a big perspective thing to wake up in the morning and, and ask God for his will to be done in our lives, which is why we pray the Our Father, every day.
Multiple times a day, I hope.
Yes, at least. Well, for us, at least 3 times a day, right?
That's exactly right. And add a rosary in that, and some other prayers as well. And when you talk about prayer and even the divine office and the morning and evening prayers, we as lay Dominicans, we took a vow. And there's lots of discussion and writings on the importance of vows. And when you take that vow, as we did as Third Order Dominicans, that kind of raises the bar even higher, because you make that commitment. So you make a commitment that you're going to do everything you can to get to daily Mass. You made that commitment that you're going to say morning prayer and evening prayer and night prayer whenever possible. And yes, life gets in the way, but we need to be we as lay Dominicans are obedient to the vows that we have taken. And it's going to be exciting because in November, Jessica, you're going to be taking your vow. Which vow are you going to be taking?
Lifelong.
Lifelong, perpetual.
Promise. Yes.
That's exciting. I mean, how does that feel?
I'm excited. I've been waiting, not always patiently, but just like what. Looking back at the beginning where I said, where St. Catherine says obedience shows whether you're grateful, and just being obedient to what God's calling us to. So many times I can recall back to just feeling called to Dominican life, and being obedient to that call, but at the same time, like wanting it to happen in my time. Like, not being obedient to God's time, but like wanting to like force things, I guess, to happen. And, whenever I felt that call to Dominican life, I really didn't know what that looked like. But through spiritual direction, my spiritual director just said, pray about it, and you're going to have to stay obedient to prayer, and you're going to have to be patient. And that's something I struggle with, just being patient, because it's like, I think it's just in human nature. We want things done in our time, and it's being obedient to know that God has an even better plan than what we think, what the best is for us. And so just in that time, I waited. I can't say always patiently, but 3 years before, in that obedience, just somehow, on the Feast of St. Catherine, I got an email that said, there would be a chapter lay Dominicans beginning in Lafayette, and
your prayers must have helped us get through that. I know while you were praying for that, we were beginning the process of starting a group, and especially with our mentors' help. Debbie and Charles and Mike had already been there even longer than us. And then, probably during those 3 years, we really needed those prayers of yours to get through the beginning and the foundation of all that administrative stuff. So, so I appreciate that, and it's nice to know. And then I'm sure when you came on, I remember you had to go through sort of a few months of going through the beginning of formation, but then you had to begin again because it was another cycle, and it was probably
it was the hardest thing. I was like, Lord, I'm here. I'm ready. You know what? I do not wait well, but I'm reminded. Well, yeah, I had to wait. I really, the Lord's like, well, if you're going to be on my time, you're going to be obedient to wait. And it's like a friend of mine always tells me, she says, God is in the waiting, is where we find God, is where he waits for us in that time. So it's definitely been the obedience to that, though has not always been easy, but it's been very fruitful.
And we think about, the one creature on this earth who was the most obedient, and what wonders and joy came from that. I mean, the Blessed Virgin Mary was obedient to God's will, and she said that she would serve and gave the fiat. And what a wonderful example that she can give to us. And we need these examples. We need these saints. We need holy people, to show us that if you're obedient, I would say 99.999% of the time, you will not go wrong. I mean, that's so important, is that, if you are obedient to God's will, discerning, what God's will is, and you won't go wrong. And that's why, we have great examples such as the Blessed Virgin Mother.
I know in this chapter it talks about even if you think the person set in authority over you is wrong with their decision, no matter what, how logical, illogical it is or whatever, that you're free. You need to, as long as it's not against a higher law, which is God's law, that you need to follow that with obedience, and it will happen the way God wants it to happen, which is the best way. So,
yeah. In obedience, I believe this was from the Summa, from St. Thomas Aquinas, when he said in one of his articles, obedience and her sister patience show whether the soul is in truth clothed in the wedding garment of charity.
Oh, that's nice. And that's why I think this chapter followed a spirit of poverty, the chapter, and as well as a couple of chapters on humility. So we had to follow, to get to obedience, we had to follow on some other virtues. And of course, the Beatitude, that spirit of poverty, which it's a beautiful, the Sermon on the Mount, another paradox, I think is the word I was looking for, another paradox, that it seems that it should be one way, like in our mind, in our human mind, but God's telling us, blessed are the poor in spirit, so.
And the Father Lagrange talks about really the ultimate sacrifice and obedience are those martyrs and those who were put to death for the faith. And, at first glance, we might think about that and say, wow, how horrible that is. But, you listen to the hundreds of stories of the martyrs going to their death joyfully, singing, praising God. And he gives an example of the martyrs singing the Te Deum as they're about ready to be put to death. And we think about martyrdom, and it's like, well, the martyrs of long ago, we don't have to worry about that or anything like that. But we need to be cognizant of today. There are Christians, there are Catholics who are being martyred, persecuted today, and especially in Nigeria and other parts of the world, that there are modern day martyrs. And we need to pray for them, but also, as a part of a reflection, that are we prepared? I'm not saying that that's going to happen anytime soon, but you never know. Are we prepared to joyfully defend the faith and go to our death, being obedient to God's will and the teachings of the Church? Are we going to be the ones that are going to just do that pinch of incense and, and still be able to live? Or are we willing to joyfully accept what God's will is for us? And in some cases, it was martyrdom for thousands of the early Christians, and even for some today.
And so, in conclusion, I'd finish a prayer that I pray often. I promise to submit to all that you require of me, Lord, and accept all that you permit to happen to me. Let me only know thy holy will. So remember to stand firm in the absolute truth, Jesus Christ, because only the truth bears grace.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death, and it stared back, standing fast in the light of the word. A shotgun blast was the last thing I heard. I rattled in the